Welcome to Through the Bible with Pastor Michael, a podcast from First Baptist Church in Mustang, Oklahoma. Here's Pastor Michael.
September, day 13, still walking through Job, chapters 19, 20, and 21. The overall themes of these three chapters are very similar. Some of the conversation and wording is different, of course, but the overall feel continues what we've looked at the last few days. So let's jump back to it. Number one, Job is doubting that he will be vindicated. We see him expressing his doubts on that. Number two, Job is feeling abandoned. This is really one of the hard parts of suffering, is when people start to feel abandoned. That abandonment can go a few ways. Sometimes people feel abandoned by their friends because their friends turn their back on them. Sometimes people feel abandoned by the Lord because they feel like He's not answering prayer, or they're crying out for help and don't feel like they're getting it. This really is the hardest part of suffering. It's feeling like you're alone. If you're hurting and somebody knows you're hurting, you can get through it. But if you're hurting and you feel like nobody knows, then that's an altogether different kind of suffering. And part of what you see happening here for Job, you just kind of see him walking through the spiral here of all the different pains. And so he had the pain of loss, and then he had the pain of as the loss is intensified, and then on top of that he has the accusations of his friends, and then on top of that he has the feeling of being abandoned. We know he's not ever abandoned by the Lord, neither are we. But sometimes we feel as if there's no one who knows what we're going through, and that's something that Job tries to articulate. The third thing we see is that his friend Zophar reiterates his view that Job is in the wrong. These friends just continue to state their case that there must be something wrong with Job. We talked yesterday about that second curse, so to speak, on the man that was born blind. We looked at that yesterday, that not only does he have the struggles of not being able to see, the struggles of being a beggar, but on top of that, we talked yesterday that he also had the struggles of the assumption of the day, being that people assumed that he had done something wrong. And what we see today is that Job's friends just continue to double down that he must have done something wrong. And because of that, we see a fourth observation, that Job is frustrated by his friend, and then he challenges him as he tells him, look, that this is not what's happened. His heart is pure before the Lord. And no matter what the accusations may be, Job continues to say that that's just not true. Friends continue to say that something must be wrong with him. Job continues to say that he's not harboring any kind of secret sin. He's walking uprightly before the Lord. And then we see a fifth thing today, that Job says the wicked seem to be getting by with it, as he tries to make sense of the world, make sense of his suffering, make sense of what the world is getting by with in his mind. It feels to him like the wicked are prospering, are succeeding, are not receiving punishment. And we see this. We talked about this several times recently, because this is something you see throughout Scripture. Psalm 73 with Asaph, Habakkuk 1 with Habakkuk. Here in Job, when they look at the world around them and they see what seems to be the righteous suffering and the wicked getting by with it, that is very, very difficult. And so Job articulates that. What do we do with it today? Number one, application. When your faith wavers, go back to the basics. Go back to the basics. When you're struggling with deep questions, hard questions, unanswerable questions, at some point we've got to go back to the basics. What do we know? We know that God created us. We know that God redeemed us. We know that God has a plan for us. We know that God is working in our life. We know that God never leaves us or forsakes us. We know that He's working all things together for good. We know that our trials on this life are light and momentary compared to what will be ours. We know that in heaven we will be home with our eternal reward. We know that in heaven there will be no more sorrow or tears or death. We just return to those basics. And when you think about the basics, it doesn't take away the questions you still have. It doesn't provide necessarily answers for things that have been perplexing you. And it doesn't even change the circumstances of what you're facing. When you think about the basics of life as a believer in the midst of your suffering, the suffering is still there. That's not going away. But when we think about the basics, the things that I just walked us through that we know to be true, it does have a way to reorient our life around things that have answers. So part of the problem is, like in Job's case, when there's suffering going on and you don't know the answers, or you can't figure out all the answers, you may never know all the answers, it can start to feel like we can't know any answers. So what we want to do is return to the basics of our faith, the things we know to be true, and get out of that spiral of feeling like everything is unknown. There may be plenty that is unknown, but there are things we can know. We can know God's goodness. We can know His salvation. We can know His nearness and His help. We can know heaven is our home. We can know God is always at work. And so when a lot of questions abound, let's return to the basics of things that we do know. Second application, be careful to not let feelings drive your theology. Don't let your feelings drive your theology. Now, certainly when you're going through suffering, you're going to feel that, and that's okay. Emotion's not a bad thing. Part of what it means to be human is to have emotion. We're not robots. We feel joy, we feel pain, we feel victory, we feel loss, we feel celebration, we feel defeat, and all the emotions that go with that. But don't let those emotions drive your theology. Don't let your emotion of the day be the determining factor of who God is. Let's instead return to the Scripture, which is our authority, and remind ourselves of what is absolutely, objectively true, whether we feel it or not. Sometimes you watch your favorite sports team play a football game, for example, and say your favorite team is a great team, they're playing a lousy team, and you expected that team, your team, to blow out the opponent, and they don't. Maybe they win on a last-second field goal. You thought they were going to win by 30, they won by 2 on a last-second field goal save. After that game is over, you may be disappointed and frustrated because your team played so bad. The fans may be frustrated and angry at the coach and angry at the play calling and angry at the players. The players themselves may feel really discouraged, and the coach may afterwards say things like, we feel like we lost. Well, that may be true, but the fact is, objectively, you won. You may not feel like you won, but objectively, you won. And while there are things to learn from the game and ways to improve, at the end of that game, you either won or you lost. There is an objectivity that trumps subjective feelings, okay? Same thing is true in our theology. There may be days you feel certain things, but objectively, what is true about God? Objectively, what is true about man? Objectively, what is true about salvation in heaven? And while our feelings are not bad things, we don't want to derive our theology from our feelings, which are so subjective. Rather, we drive our theology by what is objectively true. Whether we feel it or not, these things are true. Third application, strive to learn more about God in all situations. Learn about God when days of prosperity are there. You can learn things about God in days of pain and persecution and suffering. Always strive to be learning things about the Lord. Fourth, guard your heart against jealousy of the wicked. Don't ever look at the wicked and become envious or jealous of them. Guard your heart against that. It may seem like for a moment that the righteous are getting swept away. It may seem like for a moment the wicked are getting by with their sin. Don't let your heart grow jealous of the wicked. Like Psalm 73 says, you go into the sanctuary and there you discern their end, Asaph writes. And in the same way, we want to think objectively. What's the future for believers? What's the future for the wicked? And when we think like that, it has a tendency, hopefully, to drive away any jealousy we may have when we contemplate what is our eternal home or the eternal home for the wicked. We don't want to live jealous of the wicked. And then a final application, think often of the blessings you do have. Think often of the blessings you do have. There are things you may not have. There are things you may have lost. There are things that may have been taken from you. There are things you may not be able to do today. But spend time thinking about the blessings that you do have. Find gratitude in what God has given to you. Find joy in what the Lord has given to you that can never be taken away from you. And then our summary, we're reading at the end of each day right now in Isaiah. So a summary of Isaiah chapter 2. The Lord has a day of reckoning for all who rebel against him. This actually ties exactly into the point I was just making from Job. Back to Isaiah 2. The Lord has a day of reckoning planned, that chapter says. Knowing there's a day of reckoning for those who rebel against the Lord, let us not become jealous of them. Let us stay focused on what we do have, our salvation in the Lord, and let us strive to share that salvation with those who need it. So if you're in your day of suffering, think about the blessings you do have. Drive away any thoughts of jealousy of the wicked. Return to the basics of what you do know. Don't let your feelings drive your theology. Let truth drive your theology as you remember that the Lord in the end will deliver us and that the Lord, according to Isaiah 2, has a day of reckoning for those who rebel against him.